Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Viral Red May, Capitalism or Life. Today we have House Arrest into the Hidden Abode of Women's Work with Liza Featherstone, Kathy Weeks, Kathleen Reeves, and Jenny Brown. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you what's on tap for the next week. We've got a lot of good presentations coming up. Tomorrow at 1 p.m., we have National Security After a Viral Pearl Harbor with Daniel Bessner, Andrew Bezovich, Adam Getachew, Jean Moorfield, and Nikhil Singh. On Wednesday, we have How to Liberate Technology from Capitalism. That's at 1 o'clock, and it has Wendy Liu, Nick Dyer-Witherford, Elise Thornburn, James Steinhoff, and on Thursday night at 6 p.m., we have the Antifada, Jamie Peck and Andy Gitlitz. We'll be talking to Annie McClanahan, Aaron Benanav, and Magali Miranda Alcazar in Coronavirus and the Future of Works. So a lot of good stuff coming up. We do this entirely through the efforts of volunteers. It looks like a $60,000, $100,000 festival when we do it live, but that's all depends on your contributions. Our motto is pretend for a month that the market is not the solution to the problems that the market creates, which is a little obvious now when you could only get you could get masks for $400, and it's a Hobbesian war to get ventilators between various states, and you can't just improvise a public health system in a few minutes with just-in-time production. So come and dwell on the failings of the market with us for the rest of the month, but go to www.redmayseattle.org and click on the donate button. We depend on the kindness of strangers like Branch Dubois, and we would appreciate anything you can spare in these lean times. But without further ado, now let's go to House Arrest into the Hidden Abode of Women's Work, and to the moderator, Kathy Weeks, who's the professor of gender, sexuality, and feminist studies at Duke University and the author of The Problem with Work.
Thanks, Philip. Welcome everybody to the panel. And thanks to Philip and Sean and Mike and everyone else who makes Red May happen. So we have a great panel. I'm going to introduce very briefly the three panelists, and then they're each going to speak for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion and Q&A. So Jenny Brown is an activist, writer, and theorist with roots in the famous Gainesville Women's Liberation Group and now a member of the National Women's Liberation. You can find her articles in publications like Jacobin and Labor Notes. She has written, among other things, 2 absolutely must-read books, Birth Strike, The Hidden Fight Over Women's Work, and Without Apology, The Abortion Struggle. Second, we have Kathleen Reeves, who's a PhD student in the English department at the University of Washington. She's a feminist theorist who writes about motherhood and freedom and austerity in feminist theory and literary texts since the 1970s. And then finally, Liza Featherstone is a journalist, writer, and teacher. She writes for publications like The Nation. She is the co-author of Students Against Sweatshops, The Making of a Movement. She's the author of the wonderful Selling Women Short, The Landmark Battle for Workers' Rights at Walmart, and Divining Desire, Focus Groups in the Culture of Consultation. She has a new piece coming out on these things in the New Republic that you should all watch out for. So we're going to start with Jenny, then go to Kathleen, and then finally Liza. So Jenny.
Thanks, Kathy. Thanks for that very generous introduction. So I'll talk a little bit about my book, Birth Strike, which I think is the most relevant to the theme. In from 2003 to 2013, me and my group, National Women's Liberation, worked to get the morning after pill over the counter in the United States. It was a prescription only drug, but dozens of other countries already had it over the counter, so we thought we might be able to win it. And thanks to our campaigning and a lawsuit, the FDA finally did recommend making the pill over the counter for all ages. And at that point, the administration of newly elected President Barack Obama overruled it. He said he didn't want his young daughters to be able to buy this pill, which begs the question, he preferred them to stay pregnant when they didn't want to be. So we were really actually a little surprised that the Obama administration joined the attack on the morning after pill. We had, grumbled about the Democrats, but they seemed to largely support reproductive rights. And here we were talking about a contraceptive. So when we started the campaign, I was working for Red Stockings of the Women's Liberation Movement's archives, and we launched a project to look more closely at why opposition to contraception had become a mainstream thing in the United States again. So we looked at the history of birth control strictures in the United States. We looked at the dropping US birth rate and some of the establishment reactions to it. We looked at the situation in other countries, and then we looked at our own experience of having and raising children or deciding not to. And so I'll just give a little taste of what we found. For decades, we've been told that abortion is a wedge issue used by Republicans to split a working class Catholic base away from the Democratic Party and to excite a Protestant evangelical base. Feminist law professor Joan C. Williams recently explained, quote, starting in the 1970s, Republicans have offered support for working class anti-abortion views in exchange for working class support for pro-business positions. So you've heard this view before. Politicians in the 1% don't really care about one way or the other about abortion. They're just using the issue to get votes. But when we looked at the history, back in 1873, when abortion and birth control were completely banned in the United States, the chief reason given for that was that the birth rate had been declining, and that in particular, it was not about unmarried sex, it was about married women who were, quote, avoiding duties and responsibilities of married life, which resulted in smaller families. So, families had been 8 children per woman on average in 1800, and by 1900 they were 4 children per woman. So by the 1870s, this decline was very visible. Political elites of the time feared that women were abandoning their childbearing work at home to get jobs, and they worried that Protestant native-born women were using abortion to limit their births, while Catholics and recent immigrants were having lots of children. You can skip forward 150 years and hear some of these same anxieties. Now the US birth rate has dropped considerably below the replacement rate, 2.1 children per woman, that's regarded as stable for our level of development. And in fact, it's at a record low of 1.72, lower than it was when I wrote the book. It was 1.76 was the latest figures I had when I wrote the book. But as in the 1870s, the US's answer has always been immigration, right? To make up for the current drop, we need to have something like 3 times the immigration we have right now. And immigration at any rate is just displacing the work and costs of having and rearing children onto other mothers and other parents and other societies, all to benefit employers in the United States. And I think the right is quite open about this. Several years ago, corporate apologist Ben Wattenberg put it gleefully, immigrants are men and women who have been raised and educated on someone else's nickel. So, they understand that that's what's going on with immigration, even while they say that immigrants are taking advantage of the US system. Well, when we compared our situation in the US to Europe, where the birth rate is now low or lower than the United States in many countries, we found that the birth rate is openly discussed as a problem by politicians and in newspapers. And then efforts to raise the birth rate have mostly focused on making it easier to have children by fully funding childcare or providing long paid parental leaves. And then in some places like Turkey and Poland, we have seen leaders attack reproductive rights with the open goal of raising the birth rate. And in others like France and Sweden, where maybe the feminist movements have been a little stronger, governments have promoted policies that support parenting, and both of those countries have experienced higher birth rates as a result. And then some countries like Russia are doing both. They're increasing maternity leave and monthly government payments to parents at the same time that they're gnawing away at access to abortion and contraception. But in all cases, the reasons for the policy are out in the open. How can we get women to make more babies? Here in the US, the battle is framed as privacy, punishing sex, religion, anything but the work of having and caring for children. Well, in our group, the idea of a falling birth rate and calling it a birth strike made perfect sense to us. Many of us are in our 30s. We could clearly see how the difficult conditions we are facing are causing us to have fewer children. In a consciousness raising meeting in 2015, as we went around the room, we discovered that several of us had stopped at one child because we found it to be just too difficult. The cost, the exhaustion, the double day of working 8 or more hours and then coming home and doing 8 hours of care work and cooking and housework. And then some of us who didn't have kids testified that we wanted them, but it just didn't seem feasible given unreliable health insurance, jobs that didn't provide leave, or from watching our mothers struggle, we believed that it would put us in a sexist trap that would squeeze the rest of our lives. And we also found that our spouses were hesitant given their work lives or economic circumstances. I put 16 of these testimonies in the book. So we think that all over the country, there are women like us who are blaming themselves when they want kids, but they don't see how they can make it work. They're thinking, oh, if I'd gone into a better paying profession, if I could just find the right childcare arrangement, if I only found a spouse who worked fewer hours or did more of his share, if I hadn't gone into so much debt for school, if I had a larger apartment. In other words, we see it as something that we individually did wrong rather than understanding that this is a system that requires our unpaid work to function. Well, what is the establishment position in all of this? I found a lot of examples in establishment think tanks of fretting about the lower birth rate. They worry about flagging consumer demand. They worry about immigration and what they see as its attendant political problems, which seem to boil down to that immigrants have good class consciousness and organized unions. They worry about an aging workforce causing rises in entitlement spending. And they worry about how to keep the US military strong when both the working age tax base and the supply of young people to recruit are shrinking. So given these anxieties, the emphasis on the family, as in the ultra-conservative group focus on the family, it makes perfect sense if by the family they mean women and women's unpaid labor. Ross Douthat, who's now a New York Times columnist, explained that large families are required for their program. They make it easier to cut government. Here's a long quote from him that I think is really emblematic of the strategy. He says, "One of the things we've seen over the last 30 years is that in the absence of government programs, people aren't able to function usually as atomized individuals. You need some intermediary institutions if you're going to have small government. So you need strong families. You need people who are willing to have large families, for instance, which can then help provide for them in their old age. If Republicans are serious about reforming Social Security or finding a way to increase the number of young workers paying into the program, then having a country with higher population growth, larger families, is an obvious and conservative way to do it," unquote. So you can kind of see his thinking there. And we call their program Small Government, Big Families. And then worries about the low birth rate crossed the political aisle. Philip Longman of the centrist New America Foundation wrote a book called The Empty Cradle, where he worries, quote, capitalism has never flourished except when accompanied by population growth, and it is now languishing in those parts of the world, such as Japan, Europe, and the Great Plains of the United States, where population has become stagnant, unquote. Stephen Philip Kramer, who is a liberal and works at the National Defense University, wrote a book in 2014 called The Other Population Crisis, What Governments Can Do About Falling Birth Rates. In it, he writes, declining birth rates constitute a problem for the survival and security of nations in the broadest existential sense of national security. For several hundred years, economic growth has been tied to growth in population, increasing the size of the domestic market and labor force, unquote. So we also looked at the history of how it was supposed to work. Full-time work plus family caregiving. There was a moment when the union movement was strong that U.S. employers actually did put in resources towards the care and child rearing job. For a 30-year period after World War II, people expected the wages of one full-time male breadwinner to pay for his expenses and those of his spouse and their children, commonly known as the family wage. But starting in the 1970s, as wages stagnated and costs rose, households kept up by sending both spouses out to work, meaning that each couple is now generating 80 hours a week or more of work for employers where it had been 40. And then the job that the non-wage earning spouse used to do, child rearing, housework, caring for sick or frail family members, is no longer included in one worker's paycheck. So instead it's squeezed into the few hours left in the day after paid work. Well, the family wage obviously was sexist because it locked in discriminatory pay. It made women dependent on male breadwinners, but at least it meant that the employer was contributing resources towards the family care job. Well, we don't want to go back to the sexist system of the family wage. So we argue that the way to arrange a care economy is to go forward to an increased social wage or socialism. The term social wage is used in Europe to describe services and benefits that everybody in the society receives as a right. The most obvious is healthcare, but also universal childcare system, unionized workforce, national standards for childcare workers, and having it free like the public schools. Paid family leave for both parents, at least a year. Paid sick leave mandated by law, and not this, 5 days a year that we get if we're lucky. And then shorter work hours. In Germany, they work 10 fewer weeks a year than we do, and that would make child rearing an awful lot easier. So as long as we think of the battle over abortion and birth control as I did before I started doing this research, as primarily a cultural conflict in which two sides simply hold different worldviews, it's not really clear why corporate owners and establishment planners would have much interest one way or the other. But if we look at it as a battle over the production of humans, how many, how fast, at what cost, then it seems likely that employers as a class would have an intense interest, and they especially would care when they're called on to put in resources, as they are whenever we demand paid family leave or childcare. Their goal is an ever-expanding workforce raised with the minimum of public spending and maximum of women's unpaid work. Why would employers pay for parental leave if they can get away with not providing it? Or why would they pay taxes for childcare if families can be induced to take those burdens on themselves? But women and all parents are refusing, and that's been demonstrated by our lowest ever birth rate. And that, I think, gives us some leverage. As the birth rate goes down, the value of our unpaid labor raising successive generations can be seen more clearly by everyone. So we think it's time to bring that battle out into the open and raise some demands.
Great, thanks, Jenny. Now let's go to Kathleen.
Thank you. I want to say also thank you so much to Philip for inviting me to talk, and also to Sean and Mike and everyone else working on this massive and wonderful undertaking that is Red May. And thanks to everyone for tuning in. The COVID crisis has made it even more obvious that care work is essential work, but especially during times of economic crisis or regimes of political austerity, care is treated as though it's secondary or supplementary, that it's an extra thing that we can fund if we have extra money. And so people who do both paid and unpaid care work are punished the most by political austerity, by cuts to already meager state-funded care. So in my graduate work in English, I'm interested in literature that, first of all, demonstrates that care is at the center of world making, and second, that finds pleasure in care, or even imagines care as something beautiful, the way that art is beautiful. Now, during this crisis, I'm wondering how this literature might offer us suggestions for making political demands about care. So today I'm going to talk about a book of prose poetry. It's kind of hard to characterize, but prose poetry, I guess, that can help us think about making domestic life public. And the book is Utopia by Bernadette Mayer, which was published in 1984. Mayer is still publishing poems today. The work of hers that I'm currently most interested in, because it has the most to say about motherhood, is the poetry she wrote in the 70s and 80s when her 3 children were young. So in 1970s and 80s America, the war on poor people, women, people of color, and queer people was raging, ramping up. And in particular, when I think of this time, I think of the denigration of Black motherhood via the myth of the welfare queen, which justified cutting government programs and which pretty successfully pitted working class people against each other. So Utopia describes the speaker Bernadette's trip into the future to a utopian society in which, among other changes, there are no more landlords and almost no more prisoners, with the exception of, quote, people who've put one over on a whole population, people who are still greedy to the extent that the shame of their neighborhoods means nothing to them. They wind up having to be put, forcibly it's true, into a kind of zoo. And she includes in this list of remaining prisoners, Reagan and Kissinger. She ends this section with the description: prison wildernesses surround most of the old abandoned prisons. They are open to the public for making love and the putting on of obscene plays and poetry readings. Some are also daycare centers. So the book is especially attentive to how care works in this future utopia. So first, an aside about the role of care or domestic work in Mayer's writing in general. Her poems set ordinary details, for example, of making lunch for her kids or doing dishes or doing errands, next to abstract or philosophical claims, sometimes really like right in the same line. And so I think this resists a masculinist notion of art as insulated from, or even art as needing protection from, the work of care and reproduction. And so her writing makes clear that art and care work do not have to be in competition, which is something I think is really interesting. And this vision demands a society structured around the knowledge that care work is essential work. So I'm going to trace how Utopia seeks to make domestic life public and how it insists that radical politics must come from desire or pleasure. So the very first page of the book demonstrates both this desire to make care public, to bring the domestic out of the house, and the importance of pleasure. So if I can, I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay. Hopefully that's working. So this is how the book begins. Nobody owns the house. I was inside somewhere. It was my mother's house. I dance each morning, Socrates. And then I'm going to make dinner for all the people in the world. The sun will come out, but it won't melt the food. And the clouds will sit quietly at the table without raining. And the moon will come, but it won't get too dark. So, and I wanted to say too, I meant to say that this book is, you can see the quality of that is not great, the visual quality. It's hard to find a hard copy of this book. It's available for free legal download as a PDF from Tender Buttons Press, which is a small press in New York. So anyone can download it, but I really would love for a press to reissue this book. So those, I think that these first 3 lines that I just read, nobody owns the house, I was inside somewhere, it was my mother's house, suggest that care is necessary, that we all begin somewhere, whether or not it's literally a mother's house. But I read the line, nobody owns the house, as insisting that care cannot be privatized, that women are the ones who own this care. And then Socrates' line on the importance of pleasure, that life and therefore politics must be oriented in some way around pleasure. That's kind of how I read that. Leads me to the next moment that I want to highlight, in which Mare recounts how this book came about. So her friend, the poet Bill Berkson, in a letter asked Mare, "What's your idea of a good time?" So in the book, after she relates this question, Mare writes, "I like to wake up at noon in a leisurely way. I'd like to wake up at noon, talk and swim all day, and read and write and have fun all night. That would be perfect." On the afternoon of April 27th, 1981, having gotten up early and having had to work at a nervous pace all day, it became obvious to me that I was all of a sudden involved in politics. So it's Mare's desire for free time that leads her to politics, or her desire to live in a way that's different than the way she's living, having to work nervously all day. So initially, in response to Bergson's question, Mare wrote, as she says in the book, she wrote a short poem that she includes in a footnote to one of the book's sections. So I'm going to read the beginning of that short poem now. And again, I'm going to share my screen just a moment here. Okay. Okay. So this is the poem. Everybody sleeps in royal blue satin sheets like cucumbers in a box of snow. What's your idea of a good time? Bill Berkson. It's morning. I live on a farm at 10th Street and 2nd Avenue. We yawn like warriors in bearskins amidst our 100% cotton sheets, race to get fresh chives from our bowery for our farmer's omelet, enormous rooms, champagne, salmon, and smoked ham this morning. Since the revolution, accomplished pacifically, all artists live on large, sufficient farms in the city with other poor people, all of whom now have plenty of food, shelter, health services, and libraries. After breakfast, we go to work on books and farms in libraries and fields. We read the news. The Times is revolutionary. We put on shows. Our children study music, languages, and carpentry in the day nursery. We skip lunch and swim in the pond instead. Then we have a beer. Afternoons we read, teach children about art, and play basketball. Meanwhile, an enormous meal is being prepared of 7 vegetables and a rack of lamb with Homeric wines and demystifying lagers. We eat in hedonistic postures, all the while engaging for fun in a mock rhetoric competition, which is won today by Bill Berkson. Then we read Shakespeare, Kerouac, and others aloud to the kids for hours. After this, all the children go to bed without any sort of problem. We stay up and talk all night, occasionally partaking of ancient delicacies like English muffins and drinking an elucidating beer. We might call someone long distance who isn't here. So, what's interesting to me about this moment and others in utopia is that the utopian demands rest not on the work ethic or productivity, but rather on pleasure. So the lines I just read refer to a day nursery. And later in Utopia, when Bernadette has traveled into the future with her friends, she discusses the arrangement of free time and domestic work. And you'll see it's pretty similar to what I just read, but she's kind of fleshed it out a bit. In the afternoon, now I'm quoting, "In the afternoon, we took the children to the public nursery park so we could read and write. At 4 o'clock, since it was a hot day, we went for a swim. Fed the children, skipped any dinner of our own, and stayed up all night listening to music and eating English muffins. Did the laundry, went to the slideshow and concert on the history of the universe. It was our turn to take care of the children in the early part of the day, and then to go to the library and read some more of the contemporary magazines and books." So note that in this utopia, parents don't leave their children at the public nursery park so that they can go to work to a paid job, but rather while the children are being cared for by others, they do whatever they want. So what people in utopia are getting from this public childcare is not the opportunity to work more, but rather free time. And this free time, which in Mayor's work often includes cultivation of knowledge or interests, but also things like drinking beer and having all-night parties, feeds back into childcare when the adults read with the children or arrange public arts events for everyone. So I think by integrating childcare with moments of aesthetic pleasure, Mayor suggests that we approach the crucial question of reproductive labor through pleasure. She doesn't present the issue of the unequal distribution of reproductive labor as a question of justice, but rather as a question of pleasure. So certainly one can conclude from Mayor's work that the current distribution of reproductive labor is unjust, and furthermore that it is unjust that people's survival is linked to their ability to do waged work. And throughout her writing and in interviews, Mayor has made that very clear. But she doesn't frame the question in terms of what is right, fair, or just, but rather in terms of what would give people pleasure. So I think at this time, of course, we are concerned about basic pressing questions like, how will I survive? I hope my unemployment check arrives. But we might also think about how we want to spend our time and how, once it's safe to do so, we might take some of our care work out of the house into the public realm. So now I'm just going to finish screen share just a list of works that you might be interested in if you're interested in Bernadette Mayer. So the first one is what I mentioned, and that's available online. The second two books are other books of hers that are particularly concerned with care work and motherhood. And the last is an excellent podcast from just last year that includes a lot of interviews with Mayor and talks a lot specifically about the question of money and work. So that's all. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks. And now to Liza.
Sure. So I think we expected the apocalypse to be more butch than this, right? When we've envisioned the breakdown of society, I think many of us imagine we're living in caves, wrestling the feral hogs, but this has been a lot more domestic than that, right? We have we've seen people making all their meals from scratch, gloating over Instagramming their sourdough starter, on a far more, making their own face masks, on a far more, in a far more serious way. It has been getting dystopian, but dystopian in an equally domestic way, with people maintaining full telecommuting workloads while their kids are at home, workers who are considered essential, healthcare workers, grocery workers, face infection, but also panic over who will watch their kids. The chores have greatly multiplied. There and those are that's like all put a spotlight on work that is predominantly done by women. The closing of schools and daycare centers has pushed care work back into the home, even as we've seen wage work also pushed back into the home. There was a joke circulated on Twitter for a while. Tell us something your kid did, but begin it with the sentence, "my coworker." So, my coworker wanted yogurt, and when I gave it to her, she cried. So like my coworker has pooped on the floor, and so there was sort of an immediate sort of game acceptance of this situation, that care work is in the home and the waged work is in the home as well. Some people began to homeschool their kids. Some people did this with alarming enthusiasm, posting their wholesome family schedules on the social media. School systems compounded the confusion by having kids engage in distance learning. So we've sort of got this whole other element of care work normally performed outside of the home, education, which also had to come inside the home, and was for parents, I might add, a lot of work, unless your kids are much more enthusiastic about it than mine. With everyone home all day, the house gets much dirtier. Everything has to be cleaner than usual, or it might kill you. More meals have to be prepared. Not only breakfast and dinner, but now that everyone is home all day, also lunch. Food shopping itself is more of a challenge. You have to do it without contracting a virus, without giving anyone a virus when you're there. Clean everything with Lysol when you get home, for some very enthusiastic virus preventers. Perhaps buy groceries also for your elderly relatives or neighbors. And for people on food stamps, these tasks are even harder. They can't shop until they get their checks, but all of their neighbors are hoarding and also shopping less frequently, so buying more when they do. So many poor people find that they can't get crucial items on the shelves. Grocery shopping itself is also, if your grocery stores are enacting best practices and limiting how many people can be in the store, you have to wait for a really long time outside. All of this takes a huge toll on the family. You can hear, as the weather gets warmer in New York, more people have their windows open. You can hear parents and kids yelling at each other. You can hear people yelling at their partners. Calls to child abuse and domestic hotlines have spiked. And all of this is, before this happened, scholars were talking about a crisis of what they called a crisis of social reproduction. The social reproduction theory sounds like a complicated idea, but it's not really. When I interviewed recently Tithi Bhattacharya, social reproduction theorist, the social reproduction theory is about what she and other scholars call the processes of life making. The core insight is that capitalist profit making is completely dependent on the essential work of caring for people, keeping people alive and healthy, but it is also completely at odds with this work. That logic is sounds obvious when you say it, but is also very deep. Capitalists have to make profits, and the profits are impossible without workers. And capitalism depends on workers being alive and reproducing new generations of workers. At the same time, and that's the power when Jenny describes the birth strike and why we are sort of at an impasse over this labor in our society, where capitalist class needs women to keep doing this work, making these new generations, and yet doesn't want to do anything to make it easier. So capitalists always try to, they try perennially to try to drive down the costs for themselves. They don't want to pay high taxes. So the public institutions that we need for life making, public schools, hospitals, parks, go unfunded whenever there is a crisis of profitability. Teachers, nannies, home care workers must also be devalued with their labor unpaid and kept low. So all of this worsens with under austerity and what a lot of intellectuals call neoliberalism. So so a situation like this, the coronavirus, has the like a falling birth rate, is a sort of a crisis of social reproduction, a moment that has the power to put the spotlight on social reproduction in ways that could create a political crisis out of which some change could come. What we're discovering, that in fact the apocalypse is domestic, rather than something that involves our living in caves, is something that people all over the world have known for quite a while, right? During pandemics, but also war, famine, disasters that have become more frequent with climate change, fires, megastorms, all of the difficult work of life making becomes much harder. So, and in many places, women have known this for a long time, like pastoral nomads in arid regions of Africa are suffering horribly from drought caused by climate change for many years, and gathering water for the family, for the community, is women's work, and this work has become much more difficult during the climate crisis. Similarly, when I interviewed Tithi, we talked about an article we had both read in the New York Times about this family this family in China in which both parents were doctors, both of them having to work all the time now taking care of COVID patients. I think the article was maybe in February. So since the parents had to be away all day, the mother would make 3 meals for the 11-year-old to leave the 11-year-old on her own. And Tithi Bhattacharya noted in our conversation, the parents have the same job, but it is the mother's job to make all 3 meals for their kid before they go out, and it's one of those things that you realize is very global. So whether you're in the Horn of Africa suffering a climate crisis, or whether you're in Beijing and you're a very highly educated doctor, this disaster is going to make your social reproduction, your care work much more difficult. So So while many social reproduction theorists view all of neoliberalism as a kind of crisis, rightly, but a devastating public health disaster like this, well, the one we've been living through, can offer clarity, and also can really help people see the importance of it, and hopefully do something, and change things in a political way. It exposes the fragility of the whole system. The some of the responses by the system have, of course, been terrible. I mean, we have seen that just after the education system proved itself so indispensable to so many, we still saw almost $1 billion in education cuts in New York State. As the bodies piled up all over the city, as tents were erected in Central Park to serve as a makeshift hospital for coronavirus patients, as the city began to bury the unclaimed dead in mass graves, Governor Cuomo cut the hospital budget. So we're certainly seeing some responses by the state, and the president recommended we drink bleach. I mean, so we're certainly seeing some responses that are very dispiriting, and I don't want to minimize that. On the other hand, the pandemic has also revealed that workers and governments can adapt very nimbly and compassionately, and that our ideas about this proper role of the state can also and about our own lives can change very quickly too. And I think that is offers some a little bit of hope. I want to say a few things about little things about that. Because of the massive economic pain caused by the coronavirus, we've seen the government safety net rapidly expanding. Not enough, but much more than you might think with all of these conservatives in power. Even some Republican politicians have been arguing that the emergency relief for Americans doesn't go far enough. On our local level, there are so many terrible things we can say as New Yorkers about what's happening, but just to focus on a few things that we're encouraging. New York City, one of the reasons that New York City was initially so reluctant to close the schools was that many children count on the school systems for free meals. They have not only, after closing the schools, they have not only continued to provide the free meals to children, but also providing free meals a day to any New Yorker who wants them, which is a pretty rapid expansion of an existing program. They have also invented a new program to offer daycare for the children whose parents are essential workers. And there was something very interesting in the reporting on these new programs. They do academic school in the morning, and then they have gym and art class all afternoon. And a child who was interviewed in the New York Times about this said she really liked it. She said, in normal school, we have to work all the time. And it is sort of a sweet glimpse of, it makes you think. Does school have to always be organized that way? Does everyone, adults and children, have to work all the time? If we're in a political crisis, perhaps we should think about some of those questions. I think that the crisis we're currently facing certainly makes the kind of reforms that Jenny mentioned earlier much more it certainly makes much more visible the need for things like universal childcare, better support for parents, more sick leave, more family leave, all the things that that we all have been calling for a long time, and the horizon that Robert Heilbronner called a slightly imaginary Sweden, and we definitely need slightly imaginary Sweden. Then I think that we can also think, a social reproduction theory offers some also radical ways of thinking about how we might get further additionally by thinking about decommodifying a lot of this care work altogether. And even at its most egalitarian and well off, maybe even in imaginary Sweden, the nuclear family does arrange things in a way that it is burdensome. I mean, 2 adults is not that many. If both of them have to work full time, that's still a lot. That's still a lot of care work for both people, even if they're dividing it in a way that makes sense. And so I think it's worth thinking about some of the solutions that that people have thought about that are a little bit more outside of capitalism and the nuclear family. Recently, Michelle O'Brien has written about organizing society around more collective living arrangements, such as communes. An old idea on the left, but she's specifically thinking about how you would distribute housework and the labor of caring for children, the elderly, the sick. Going back to the early 20th century, the Bolshevik feminist Alexandra Kollontai imagined that the communist state could free women from the burdens of the domestic sphere, and her idea was that they would be freed to participate fully and work outside the home. Kathleen, I love your attention to the idea that they could also do all kinds of other things, right? I mean, but Kollontai was focusing on building the communist state, all hands on deck, everyone needed to be at work. We don't necessarily need to think that way. But she imagined all day, besides all day childcare, also that the communist state would have restaurants, free restaurants, free cafeterias, free laundries. And those ideas were revived by Margaret Benston in her 1969 essay that is credited with starting or restarting the social reproduction theory movement. Kollontai also imagined that you could make house cleaners into public servants who would clean everyone's apartment for free. So that sounds like a great place for all of us to go. So I think that the coronavirus has been while it has been very rough on everyone who performs care, it is also the sudden visibility of the work is good news for everyone who does this kind of labor. And I also want to say something about the potential flexibility of all that we have all discovered for ourselves in this time. I really don't like social distancing. I'm sure none of you do. It really sucks. I mean, I think that it's just, but what's interesting is we have learned that when we have to, we can take responsibility for the lives and well-being of others, and that we can profoundly change our lives. We can rearrange our lives to do that. I think social distancing is estimated to is projected to perhaps spare as many as 600,000 people's lives. I mean, that's something that we have all kind of collectively agreed to do. So even as we've seen these dramatic inequities and gaps in our organization of care work in this time, we have also shown that we can really organize our society around an active care, and with the understanding that the work of keeping people alive has to be shared by all. And if we can rebuild with that insight, we'll be better off than we were before.
Great, that was wonderful. Those are, yeah, there's so much going on in all of these talks, and there's so many points of connection. And we've got some really interesting questions. I've got some big ones myself, but
Go ahead.
we'll start with this. I mean, and I think these are, again, I think these would be opportunities for everyone to kind of comment on the other's presentation as well. And because I think these kind of get at some of the questions. So one is, how might we make demands for universal health care, universal childcare, fewer working hours, etc., without falling into a pro-work and pro-capitalist narrative? And I would even add to that one too, because there's two versions of the pro-work, pro-capitalist narrative, because the other side of that is always pro-family. It's always family values, right? I mean, it's part of that whole system. So there's a kind of family ethic, family values that is another form of the work ethic, because it gets people to, dedicate their lives. And it feels like those are always the dual traps that I think you fall into when you make some of these demands, either the kind of moralization of the family and celebrating the importance of reproductive labor as something that we should all be doing, which is why I loved Kathleen's stuff about centering pleasure in all of this as a way to nicely upend that. But the question is about, so how then do you make these kinds of demands that would really sort of help people in their day-to-day lives through this kind of navigating this crisis, without falling into either a kind of pro-work ideology, this will help people be better workers, or pro-family ideology, this will make our families better? I mean, like, how do you think about how to cast some of these demands? There are other questions there too about, should we demanding services or collective self-organization? And I want to get into that stuff too, but I just wonder if people have any thoughts there about how do you navigate those, those shoals?
So I had a couple of thoughts on the childcare thing. So a couple of close-in members of our group are childcare teachers, and they point out that the kids in many ways have a longer day than the adults because they are dropped, first they have the commute, then they are dropped off at the childcare, and then they're picked up after the adult gets off of work, and then they're, so she thought that one way that we could, one of our childcare teacher members thought that one of the ways that we could start talking about this is we should have our work days shortened to the school day. In America, the school day assumes that there is somebody home at 3 to take care of the kids right after school. And people say, oh, well, we should have childcare or after school programs that extend, so that after the parents get off from work. But really, we should be demanding that the parents get off from work at 3 too. All of them, everybody, not just the women, obviously. So I thought that was kind of if we start from a shorter work hours standpoint, rather than starting from demanding childcare so we can work more, I think that might help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right, Jenny. It always it always goes to we need more childcare so that because of the illogic of the school workday mismatch, but nobody ever suggests maybe give the capitalists less time and leave the school day as it is.
There's an obvious reason for that. That's when they're making their profit.
There's a very obvious reason why we don't think of that, right? And so, as to Kathy's question, that's something that I think that I think about it a lot, but I especially thought about it while working on this piece, that that it's very it's like the only acceptable horizons are the ones that the ones that result in women performing labor. So they're either going to be good mothers and care workers at home, or they're going to be doing a great job of making profit for capitalists. But the political disputes are almost always about in which of these categories is the woman going to labor, not what if the woman had more time in her day in which she simply didn't do any labor, what if she had more time to like meet her lover or have lunch with her friends outside, I mean, that would clearly be better. And so I do think that there's room for yeah, I mean, as I said, I think I think some of our thinking on this on the left is shaped by the fact that these early communist regimes had to they had to build economies from scratch. They had to make everybody they had to make everyone work all the time. I mean, they were in fact their criticisms of sex work are, it's not productive. Women need to be in the factory. You know what I mean? Like there was a sort of an imperative that loomed over everything to get everybody to work in the same way that there is in our capitalist society, right? Like that everyone needs to be at work. But I wonder if our thinking our thinking about that has been formed by the real needs of those early regimes. But now that we're in a world where actually less growth would be healthy for our planet, and when we're working, we're really just making profits for capitalists rather than building the great communist state. Like maybe on the left, our priorities should now be different and more open to that expanding that part of your day where you're just doing what you please.
Yeah, I think also I think about the family piece that you brought up, Kathy, and nowadays people are getting married later. Some people don't get married at all. Some people don't even have partners, or but while we live in a society where care is privatized into the family, it's hard to not have a family, or to not have at least a partner. Financially, emotionally, it's hard in a lot of ways. And so we're in this we're stuck in this loop, I think, where a lot of people realize, people in families and people who are not in families, know that the nuclear family can make people very lonely, and of course overburdened and overworked and all of that too. But it's hard to get out of that while we don't have so much public care. But I think there's sort of a lag here. But I mean, it's like more and more people want lives that are not necessarily structured by a nuclear family, or even if they have that life, they don't want their life to be totally defined, their social lives to be defined by that exclusively, right? And that's one thing I love about Mayor's work, is that she was a woman in a heterosexual partnership with 3 kids. So in many ways, she had a very traditional life, but in her work, she always has friends coming over, or she's going to see friends. People are stopping by and drinking beer, you know, eating English muffins or whatever she says. And so she's really like trying to get out of the single family home or apartment or whatever, which I find really interesting. But I'm not sure how, I guess I'm not sure how to make those political demands, but realizing that and thinking about the family critically is a big part of it.
So okay, that brings me up to the big question then. And Red May, we are going to have a panel on this later in the month about family abolitionism, but it's rearing its head right now in my thinking here, just because, you know, Liza, you mentioned how in this moment we're getting this kind of new visibility, or the potential of a new visibility of kind of reproductive labor based in the domestic, and I've actually felt the opposite, that it's been surprising how other forms of waged work have emerged as, you know, who knew grocery workers were so important, you know, and yet they don't make much money. So some things are being kind of clarified. But when the media talks about the family and the home, it's really about the quality of personal relationships, and then a little bit about how hard it is to teach math, you know, but there isn't a lot about the kind of stuff that you talked about, Liza, about just all of the gritty work that has to be done, that, you know, gets, you know, magnified in times of austerity in, you know, all over the world. And I'm just wondering about the stubborn invisibility of domestic work. And again, it's a perennial problem for feminists. You know, how do you publicize and politicize this kind of work without again moralizing it or making it just instrumental to capitalist work? And I'm just wondering how much the institution of the family has to be kind of confronted head on, because, you know, at one point, Jenny, you mentioned that you were talking about someone else, and you kind of questioned like, well, it depends on your definition of the family. But if your definition of the family is all this unwaged work that women will do there for free, well, I'm wondering if that is in fact the definition of the family, like that the privatization of it, you know, the way that it, like maybe what's definitive of the institution of the family is the way it can be leveraged to provide uncompensated reproductive labor, because it just works so well. Like even in a crisis, it's working well to make that completely invisible. And what if the family, I mean, do you think that the family as an institution is defined by that kind of privatization, and that maybe, you know, some of our critical thinking and political action needs to target that institution, or is that not how you're thinking about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that well, I think that a major goal of all left or socialist feminism should be to make family families and family structure totally optional, right? I mean, that should be the, like, we should be trying to, that's the society which we're trying to build. We have exactly the opposite goal of Jenny's bourgeois thinker that she quoted, you know, who like wants to, you know, force us all into the family to save the government money. That's exactly the opposite of what we want, right? Like we want the state, we want as many of these functions socialized, so that you know, if you do get into a nuclear family, you know, the parents have more time to have fun and actually enjoy their kids, and if you don't want to join a nuclear family, you aren't going to starve in the street, and you won't be all by yourself in your old age. You know, I mean, like this is like, I think that we just want it. We want to create a society in which it is all absolutely optional. But the problem that you pose, Kathy, is like, is the family, does the family's existence and our cultural attachment to it get in the way of such a horizon? Like, I mean, or like, and even to more intermediate things, because, you know, we know, I mean, the coronavirus is one of the interesting things, many interesting things that happened, was so people couldn't depend on grandparents anymore for childcare. because because we're supposed to be we were supposed to be socially isolating from older people, in order to not give them the coronavirus. And I think that it was interesting to see that there was a state in Italy that closed workplaces before they closed schools, and thus suffered really rapid spread of the virus because all the kids just went to be looked after by their grandparents. And it was when I read about that, I thought, man, that's a really, policy. On the one hand, that's like policy being made by somebody who has never had the job of organizing social reproduction for their household, because anyone else would have thought of that. Like, oh, if we close the schools, all the kids will go and be watched by their grandparents. But it's also a window into precisely what what you and Jenny are identifying, that because the family is there, it is something that the state is just the neoliberal government is just used to taking for granted. That if we take certain things away, then people will just have that to fall back on. But yeah, absolutely. I think our goal should be family optional societies.
With a room of one's own. I mean, I think this is a feminist demand that really needs to, in this time of housing crisis. I mean, all these crises are being put into our lives, and we need to make the ruling class have a crisis, of course, but the housing crisis is one where people are just jammed together, and so a room of one's own has to be in there. We can't get too nostalgic about the intergenerational families. I mean, back when intergenerational family was also forced on us by economic circumstance, people didn't want to live with their in-laws and their nasty aunt, and they would get in fights, and it was not necessarily, it has to be optional. as Liza says, singlehood, make singlehood viable for everybody, and then we can arrange things the way we want to.
Yeah, there should be a demand for a single wage, like as opposed to the family wage. It's like everyone should get the single wage. The other, Kathy, to your point about the visibility and how you feel it's actually remained invisible, I think that it's become, care work has become more visible in a couple ways, and when I say that, part of what I mean is that it's more people have to do it all the time who didn't have to do it before. So more men have to perform a lot more of this labor than they did. More well-off people have to perform a lot more of it than they did. And then also that with significant care workers not being part of kids' everyday lives, without the teachers, without the babysitters, without the daycare workers. I think a lot of people are noticing the absence of those workers in their lives, but also a lot of people who performed plenty of care work already in their homes are more stretched and noticing it even more. So it becomes in a sort of like they do in Jenny's groups, in a sort of a consciousness raising group. People are, I think, raising their own consciousnesses a bit more about it, about the work that they perform as well. Of course, some of it, there's also a fair amount of ridiculous, cheerful, conspicuous social reproduction, in the, like, people, like, I mean, and I've participated in this too, like, people posting what you baked on the Instagram, whatever. And like that just contributes to a general acceptance.
Yeah.
It's such a good question, Kathy, about how we discuss the institution of the family. And it just, again, this is kind of like what I said before, it just strikes me as really difficult to really go after it until it's like these two things are happening together, right? That the state is not providing for people and we're in families. But as long as the state is not providing for people, it's really hard to tell a person, especially a woman who has kids, not to get married, right? Because there are so many protections that currently provides for a woman with children. So it's tough to figure out how to chip away at the dominance of the family while still feeling protected, especially if you have children.
So there's a lot of questions that in some ways are about kind of strategy or tactics, but I think that open up bigger kinds of questions too. So I think you could tackle these at the level of, real demands and tactics, or just talk about them more generally. But I'm going to put two together. So one is, what roles do you and your comrades see for the state? I'm reminded of Sylvia Federici's demand that people, quote, organize their own child care, unquote, then the state pays for it, right? So what are your takes? State organized versus state paid childcare. And it's kind of related to an earlier question, what are examples of care work we should take into the public / make common? And I'm wondering if those are actually two different things, making it public in the sense that the state provides it, or make common, because I think, Federici was talking about, we should be self-organizing some of these things and then having someone else pay for it. And I mean, I think that opens up a lot of questions, again, about both strategy and trying to think more broadly about what we want social reproduction to look like.
Yeah, I think in the early feminist movement, in the women's liberation movement, the younger branch and more radical, a lot of work was done around organizing childcare collectives. Of course, it was not paid by the state, unfortunately, and the organizational job of doing that also needs to be paid, not just the care itself. So. This was really the debate in the 70s was around community control, both of the childcare but more broadly of the schools, which often took the nature of that it was run by whites and most of the students were Black. So community control, I think, is really essential. It does not mean, however, that we have to self-organize everything. I mean, that's a lot of work that somebody should have that as their job. I don't think that's automatically the state. It's the government. And I'm not sure why state is used there instead of government. Maybe because it sounds a little more hostile, but I think, I'm completely supportive of public schools. I think that's the way we need to organize things. We do not need a bunch of fragmented little fiefdoms of people trying to organize their own stuff. The track record isn't good. On the other hand, the public schools need real funding, and a lot of that, we can see if you starve public things, then they turn out crappy, but then it becomes evidence that government can't do anything, and then that causes, I think, a lot of people to turn away from it and try to do homeschooling and all of these other things, when in fact what we need to be demanding is really decent pay for everybody and good resources. I mean, I went to high school in in the 70s in California, right before the effects of the property tax revolt came in. And those schools had funding, they had resources, they were good all across San Diego where I was. And they had more money than they knew what to do with in some cases. And when that austerity hit, it was like a bomb. It destroyed the California public school system. So, you know, there's only so much teachers can do in the middle of that crater. And as striking teachers keep pointing out.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I mean, I think what we've seen is, you know, in a lot of well-functioning sort of societies that function better than ours, there is a mix of extensive self-organizing by citizens and a really robust state that provides a lot of protections. Kerala, India seems like a pretty good example. The state of Kerala in India is a pretty good example of, I mean, I think it's, you know, the self-organization, you know, in communities does invest people more in the institutions that they're creating, and it also gives people more control over them, which is good. But you also do need, I think, a robust state to centralize a lot of these things. In terms of thinking about social reproduction, the impression that I get from having spent some time recently reading and interviewing people about this is that that while the Silvia Federici tradition is much more along the lines of, you know, you organize it, and that the recent traditions have been a little bit more perhaps statist or pro-government or whatever, or however we want to say that, a little bit more thinking more about the robust state, while also taking communalism really seriously. That that if you were to organize society in a way that gave people a real alternative to the family and a real way out of working all the time on both fronts, you probably would need a lot more communal structures that might not just be about the state funding your care work, but might also be about organizing yourself into more collective ways of living.
And as Jenny's book, Birth Strike, makes clear, that care for children and care for the elderly are connected.
Yes.
Right. So one of the reasons that people may have children, among many, is that you want someone to care for you when you're older. Mm-hmm. And so if we didn't have to worry about being put into horrible nursing homes in our old age, but instead some sort of publicly funded thing that, I mean, nursing homes are one example of clear example that like privatized care doesn't work very well, right? So I just wanted to think about those things together too.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. So here's and I'm going to try to combine these to give people more options for how you want to respond. But one is, we haven't yet discussed sex work or sex as care. Mm-hmm. How do folks see sex and erotic pleasures getting into all of this? That's a complex question because we're talking both sex as kind of a form of income generating activity and also sex as, you know, in the domestic space, plus pleasure and erotics maybe is something that's more expansive than those two things. So that already seems a little bit big, but there's another one that is, what's the relationship between pleasure and justice? Pleasure practices and justice practices.
Mm-hmm.
In what ways should communists and socialists assert forms of justice as pleasure and vice versa, which I think gets us into some of the territory that Kathleen was talking about too. So I'll throw it to you guys.
I think Kathleen should address that one because you've been
I'll
really
start.
focused on it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the second part of that question, or the second question you asked, Kathy, the relationship between justice and pleasure. I think about one book that has really influenced me along those lines is by Linda Zerilli, who's a political theorist, who wrote a book, Feminism and the Abyss of Freedom. And her argument in that book is that political judgments are actually, we should think of them as aesthetic judgments, which just rings really true to me, I think. Like, people make political decisions based on more something that's, and she goes really far into Kant and other things like that in her book, but basically what she's arguing is that people make political decisions based on a sense of like, that something seems beautiful to you, or that it gives you a sense of pleasure in that sense, right? Rather than that something is right. So her point is that feminists should think of their own politics as a process of together articulating their desires and pleasures. And I was going to say one more thing about that. Well, maybe that's it for now.
So I could just say, I mean, I think, you know, Kristen Godsey nailed it with the why women have better sex under socialism. You know, men can't be jerks and selfish in bed, and you know, basically when we have social solidarity and equality, and women have self-determining lives and jobs, and they're not dependent on other people or for their livelihood or their housing or their self-esteem. So I think that that addresses this question of is sex in itself care work? You know, it's certainly caring, but is it work? That's the question. And if it is work, then I think we need more equality, because it shouldn't be work. I think that's wrong.
Right. I mean, I agree. I tend to think of it as I mean, I tend to think of sex optimistically as being as being pleasure, about pleasure, and that pleasure is a crucial part of the political horizon, right? I mean, that we want a society in which pleasure is much more where most people have access to much more pleasure than they now do, right? I mean, that's and so I think a friend of mine whose politics are very liberal once said to me, "So your politics are basically that you think everyone should just get to have sex in the middle of the day." And I was like, "Yeah." Like, basically, I mean, like, that's if you want a guide to the ways how society should be better organized, yes. All of the things that I politically support would make it easier for some people to have sex in the middle of the day if they want to. So, but I think, yeah, is sex work and is it part of social reproduction is an interesting question that I had been bumping up against myself in recently as in trying to write about these things, and I don't know. I don't know if it is. But I think sex workers would certainly be workers who perform social reproduction. Like that's it. Like in that context, it's definitely labor that is a part of care. And
Absolutely.
and in that context, I would think of it as labor that should be well compensated, like all care work. Um, but when we think of sex in general in most people's lives, I would agree with Jenny. I would hope we would I hope we would be able to remove it out of the realm of labor and into the realm of things that people can do or not do as they like.
Yeah, just like therapists should be paid for therapy work, but talking to a friend is not necessarily a commodified version of that, right?
Right. It's not
That way,
necessarily emotional
in
labor.
that way, if you're doing sex work as a job, it should be well compensated. You're doing it as a job. That's your job. It shouldn't be, regarded as. But as you say, it is part of this area of social reproductive labor dominated by women and femmes who are then, basically we're able to be ripped off because we have less power in the society. So we are ripped off as a result.
And I think in some partnerships, sex is work.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, still, maybe more so in the past, but still now it's work that's required for a person to, it's sort of informally understood that it's required for a person to maybe continue to have a stable place to live or something like that.
Or intimacy is a way to have
Right.
intimacy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So here's a broad one, and I think it gets us back, but maybe we could use this to kind of sharpen differences among us, or maybe we all agree, I don't know. But should socialists be fighting to wage all unwaged work or to de-wage all work, which I like that formulation, right? So, I mean, is the goal to try to get unwaged work waged, as in the old wages for housework kind of campaign? Is it more about decommodification and the social wage, or is there some balance between them? I mean, is the goal really to try to de-link work from the wage, or to try to get wages to cover more of the work that we do?
I have a thought on that. I mean, I think when we talk about the universal basic income or guaranteed annual income, as it used to be called, and even the wages for housework movement, often what we see is that the idea is that you will then take that little UBI supplement that you get, and you will go out onto the market and then attempt to buy the things that you need for your life, right? So it becomes an excuse to have even less of a social wage than we do right now. And because you're going out with that little amount of cash and everybody else is going out with that little amount of cash, then you have this great recommodification of a lot of things so I tend towards the decommodification side of this, where once you guarantee healthcare, childcare, housing, food, and the other necessities of life, the wage becomes much less important. This is really what basically happened in most socialist countries. A lot of that stuff was provided, so the wage was low, but it was not there wasn't much that you were going out and purchasing on the market yourself. So I think we obviously need wages. We need, you know, compensation for our work, but I don't think that it should, that we should be dependent on our jobs for all of the things that are required to live in a decent situation. So, so I'm very, you know, I used to be a big advocate of universal basic income, and I've become skeptical of it because I can see this, this tendency to, oh, well, then let's make everything something that you purchase. And I just think that that direction is the wrong way to go.
Yeah, what Jenny says mirrors my own thinking so closely that I don't think I have much to add to that, actually.
Yeah, and maybe me either, but I definitely don't think we should wage more kinds of work, give more, and you know, the wages for housework movement was largely about, you know, I think as Federici said, we want to, their goal in waging work was to destroy work or something. There was a quote along those lines, to end capitalism, not to have more people be paid. That was maybe sort of a political
Fabrication,
strategy, right? So yeah.
Yeah, very much. They thought it was a consciousness raising exercise to teach people that the work that they were doing was valuable.
Right.
That was very much a part of that struggle.
And this actually links back to pleasure, because I'm remembering another Federici quote that's one of my favorites. I think from that Wages for or Wages Against Housework, one of those two articles she wrote. We want to call work what is work, so that we may something know what is love, so that we can call love what is love, and discover our sexuality, which we have never known.
Right.
Yeah. So let's, here's what, okay. What are the tactical, strategic, I would add larger, you know, things to think about in terms of refusing care work and social reproduction, like the model of the strike. Like if we're getting back to this question about how to publicize and politicize all of this massive amount of reproductive work without which this thing called the economy would not exist. What about strike? And I mean strike, you know, broadly, you know, strike could take other kinds of forms, but I mean, you know, at what point this model of refusal, I mean, you know, Jenny too, I mean, it is a birth strike, whether it's conscious or not in some ways. And what are the potentials of this strike as a way to try to like publicize and politicize some of this work that's not being recognized or supported in any meaningful way?
Well, I mean, I think the model right now is the teacher strikes, where starting with the Chicago teachers, they specifically included a lot of the things that the communities needed, from nurses to parks to all of this stuff. And you know, in U.S. labor law, you are not allowed to bargain those things, right? And they ignored that and made it clear that that was why they, you know, they were on strike for the bread and butter issues, but they were also on strike for these things that they are not allowed to mention. So they had to navigate that. And as more teacher strikes occurred, that became a much more natural part of how that operated. So I think it's very I mean, the strike is incredibly effective if you have a target and some goals. The birth strike itself, the idea of the birth strike, I mean, we sat around for a few years and said, should we be calling a birth strike? That didn't make any sense, because, you know, people are trying to have kids, they're trying to not have kids. It didn't really click. but what clicked was when we thought, we're already, like, if we had called a birth strike 10 years ago, we would feel that we had been fabulously successful because the birth rate has gone down so much. I mean, these things are already things that people are weighing, but the other thing about a strike is it's got to have demands, right? So and generally it has to be time limited so that you can actually get some of the things that you want. And in the case of a birth strike, part of it is we want to be able to have kids if we want to. This is,
Mhm.
From the late 90s, when reproductive justice advocates coalesced around the program of reproductive justice, they made this point that, when the feminist movement gets boiled down to the right not to have kids, you are missing the whole other part of it, which is the right to have kids and the right to raise them in healthy and decent conditions. And that, the Black feminists who started it, have now basically made this the logic of, I think, of the movement in many ways. So part of what we want to strike for the stuff, and the stuff that we identified as the four big things that we want are shorter work hours, childcare, universal health care, and paid family leave, and not this, like, oh, we'll give you 12 weeks to split between the parents. We want, like a year each, something that's really worth fighting for.
Yeah, I think the strike is, I mean, the strike is going to be crucial to making this into a real political crisis. And I think, the birth strike is so great, and it or framing it that way, and it's now it's now making me think of actually all the other things that people are unable to do because of their circumstances, and the power of renaming that as a strike. So yesterday, May 1st, in New York, thousands of people went on rent strike. But we won't know how many because so many people also just didn't pay their rent because they couldn't, because of unemployment and the sort of economic devastation of the coronavirus. But by calling it a rent strike, the strikers kind of invited everybody who just couldn't pay rent to be committing a political act by that. And there's and I think there's the birth strike is a similar logic, that it makes sense to like look at the things look at what you can't do, but reframe it from a position of power. I think we're going to see, I think also as things open back up and there are disputes about the safety of care workers in doing that, I think we're going to potentially see a lot of power in the teachers' strike again. I think we're going to see places where there's a rush to open schools back up and put teachers and their whole communities at risk. And I would imagine that we're going to see a lot of teachers going on strike for that.
Well, for people who aren't in New York, I mean, they may not be aware that that the schools were closed in New York under threat from some insurgents in the teachers union, the Moore Caucus, to lead a sick out.
Yeah.
And this, I mean, the schools were closed much later than they should have been, but they could have continued along their merry way, and we hear this thing of, oh, well, it doesn't affect young people as much, so the schools, but what about the teachers and the staff? We've had a lot of teachers and staff in New York have died as a result
Yeah.
of that late closure and other bad moves on the part of the administration. So it directly relates to that, and that was extremely effective.
Yeah. Yeah, it was, although it was almost the last minute that they could have possibly kept the schools open from a public, considering that New York is under more of a technocratic logic than our federal government. I'm not sure how long they could have held out. I think the sick out was a powerful last minute kick. I think that the teachers union could have saved thousands of lives by leading a strike a week earlier.
Yes, that's
Um,
true. Yeah, it had to be done by an insurgent caucus.
Yes, exactly,
You know.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. So, but I think that I think we're going to certainly be seeing strikes of care workers and the strike as an act of care, as it was in the case of the more sick out.
Kathleen, do you have anything on the strike?
No, I think that was really well said. I hadn't thought of, that's a great point, Liza, about rent strikers and people who can't pay their rent being the same. I mean, or you can think of them as the same,
Yeah.
or they're doing the same thing in that moment, even though they come from different maybe backgrounds and perspectives.
Yeah, yeah. It's a very inclusive gesture to relate.
Yeah.
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 There's a question that's particularly for Jenny, but I think anyone could jump in on it. There was a heated conversation in the chat about that there's currently two birth strike movements, one coming from the perspective of care politics and the other from eco-politics. And we're assuming that that means both liberal and neo-Malthusian arguments, as well as eco-fascist arguments. So that there's two kinds of birth strikes, one from care politics and one from a particular kind of eco-politics. And are these two birth strikes compatible?
Ooh, Jenny, go get him.
Yeah, I mean, so the book came out in March of last year, Birth Strike, and I was Googling birth strike, and at that point, the only things that I saw on there were characterizing the low birth rate in South Korea as a birth strike. A few weeks later, this British group called themselves Birth Strike, and their argument was that they were being pressured to have kids, and they wanted to make the point that the climate crisis is so urgent that no, they are not willing to have kids in the midst of this climate crisis unless governments start to really step up. And so part of it was that they themselves were trying to defend their own decisions around this. But it became sort of like, oh, well, you know, the reason we have a climate problem is because we have too many kids, maybe especially in Western countries. If we would just not have so many kids, we wouldn't have a climate crisis. This is a completely different argument from what I'm making. And my own take on it is that, you know, basically we need to attack our enemy in the climate crisis is the fossil fuel industry. We need to euthanize it as fast as possible. And actually this coronavirus moment when oil prices have gone through the floor is an excellent time to do that. Let's just nationalize the whole thing and strangle it. And that needs to be the focus. I think when you start talking about births and the question of climate catastrophe, you immediately end up in this argument that the problem is that there are too many people, and that has a long racist history as well as just being simply wrong. We do have the capacity to make you know, a climate-friendly future without mass death or lower birth rates. That those aren't solutions. The solution is to attack the fossil fuel industry with laser precision.
Anybody else?
Well, and it like you just said, Jenny, it shifts the blame and distracts us from the real issue, and ends up then dividing people against each other, right? It's a way to further divide people who have children against people who don't have children, And both of those contingencies need, or constituencies need care, right? A single person needs care, a person who has children needs care, and they shouldn't be at each other's throats. So,
Excellent point. Yeah.
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 Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, I think the birth strike, I think the birth strike for ecological reasons, yeah, like Jenny said, it misstates the real enemy, which is capital and the fossil fuel industry, and as usual, locates the problem on women and their irresponsible reproductive
Right.
choices. And
right.
like, I'm not a fan of that. And then also, I also think, and maybe this is a little bit petty on my part, but I think there's a little bit of a, I I think it's kind of insidious that women feel that they have to make their non-reproducing into a generous narrative about their sacrificing for the planet. Like, why should they have to? Like, why can't they just not have kids if they
Right.
don't want to? You know what I mean? Like, and I sort of feel that it's yeah, that in addition to sort of misspecifying the planetary problem, I feel from as a feminist on multiple levels, it kind of offends me in those ways. I do think that you could understand the ecological conditions as part of what people are consciously or unconsciously birth striking about, and as part of your demands, right? Like the low birth rate. I know, Jenny, your groups didn't talk about the ecological crisis as reasons why they weren't having kids, but some millennials do say that they're
Well,
concerned.
there is one testimony in the book addressing that, and as I've gone around and given book talks, I've had several more testimonies from people who are
Yeah.
just terrified of the future, and they're like, "Am
Yeah.
I going to bring a kid into this? I don't see how this is even going to work." So
Yeah.
yes, absolutely, that is a theme.
So it should probably be thought of as one of the demands, like that
Yeah.
that you know, if the government wants women to make babies, one of the things it should do is address the climate crisis. So I think there's a way to
Exactly.
sort of reconcile those ideas.
Great, we're close to time, so I'm gonna let Philip come back in, and he might have a question, and he might tell us about how to help pay for Red May.
Why, thanks, Kathy. I wish you guys had a weekly TV show so we could repeat this constantly. I found it sort of rich and absorbing, particularly the way you find these kind of bon mots that sum up a lot. That quote from Ben Wattenberg, Jenny Brown, every time I hear it about the first 21 years are on someone else's nickel. I mean,
Amazing.
this seems to be the moment when subtext is speaking itself aloud in ways that are somewhat surprising to me. The naked thing to go back to work, you know, I think of Ginsberg's Mammon being fed, Mammon, Mammon, Mammon. And Kathleen, that focus on pleasure, and that one line from Bernadette Meyer, give everybody everything, I think is just a wonderful slogan.
Yeah.
That we should instantly adopt. And I think Jasper Burns wrote something on in what Bernadette Meyer in one of his chapters. I had never read her, even though I knew some of those people who were part of the downtown scene. So I bought some book. I think it's going to a state. Does she have one going to a state park?
Poetry State Forest.
Poetry State Forest.
That's a good one.
I looked at it. I haven't read the whole thing. It looks great. But there's something wonderful about that downtown utopia. It's a very, very impoverished or not impoverished, that's the wrong word, but it's a very simple utopia. It's like going to Allen Street and getting some Russian rye bread and cream cheese. That's enough for like the whole day to feel like you're essentially in a cornucopia. And it just makes you realize, around the sort of the diggers and everything in the East Village scene that grew up in the 60s, there was a lot of feeling that we can more or less make a utopia about anything if we don't have to work.
Yeah.
Which seems like the core thing. And Liza, you just seem to have a genius for first lines. That line about, I thought the apocalypse would be more butch. My reaction to that is, I think that's what those people who are protesting against lockdown felt too. They had seen so many apocalypse movies on TV, and it wasn't happening like that. So they had to go out and get their guns and flags and sort of act it out. And if you've ever seen that one photo of everybody pressed up against the glass is like the best frame that George Romero never took. I mean, so this is really wonderful. I mean, there are a lot of questions I could ask and would that could go on for a long time, but I guess I should make a pitch for money, which I really don't enjoy doing. I don't enjoy working, and I don't enjoy making pitches for money. But having said that, I will make a pitch for money.
But people want to give money. They want to give to the thing.
Want to give money. Your hand is reaching towards your pocket. The credit card. Well, you don't carry a credit card in your pocket when you're in quarantine. I mean, that's stuff you probably can't even find it in the house. But if you do, and if you go to www.redmayseattle.org and click on the donate, it will help us stage more of these festivals, even live ones next year. We've got a lot of great stuff coming up. Tomorrow is National Security After a Viral Pearl Harbor. That's at 1 p.m. So please come to that. And thank you for listening in today. Enjoy the rest of your day in quarantine.
Thank you.